fill in for them. Last Wednesday we did a Bible study on Hebrews and went through that as a pretty quick review in about an hour. I may mention a little bit of Hebrews today, in fact. But we're going to, in the Bible studies on with Pastor Leah on discipleship on Sundays, we've been looking at 1 Samuel and marching through it. I'd like to start with just a really quick 4 or 5 minute review, maybe a little longer, not too much, not a whole hour review, but I want to start back at the very beginning because I had missed quite a few of the discipleships when we were at the very beginning of 1 Samuel. So I'd like to start there, if that's okay, kind of talk about the book in general. Let's see, 1 and 2 Samuel, by the way, I'm not sure if you realize this, but when they divide the books up into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, initially those were all one book originally, and I'm assuming that's the way that is a lot of the texts here. What's happening is that the scrolls are so long that over time, basically, they just shorten them into 2 different sections. And this is appropriate too with the book of Samuel because what you see is, well, basically you have this, I'm going to just divide it up into sections. What you see is 3 main characters, obviously, and I've always kind of wondered this, why in the world isn't the book actually called the Book of David? And for the most part, as far as I know, it always links back to the idea of the prophet. And what you see with Samuel here. So it does begin with Samuel, and the idea of the first, in the first few chapters there, chapters 1 through 7 are about Samuel, and particularly about Hannah. Hannah is the mother of Samuel, and basically there in the first few chapters you get Hannah, who is having a lot of grief because she can't have a son, or can't have a child. She eventually does have a child, Samuel, okay? And then in the chapter 2, I believe, somewhere in there, there's this famous section called Hannah's Song. And you can see it's definitely sectioned off a little bit in particular text where you see the song coming, kind of like a psalm as a song. There's a few things to take away from that, and why is that song placed in the very beginning? Well, it's pretty easy to see that song is going to echo as you go through Samuel. The main points of the song in its themes, etc., highlight the things that Saul and David are going to go through with themselves. And I made just a quick list here of a reference I heard about trying to wrap that up. Like, what is that song about? What are the main, or some of the themes that are running through Samuel? First is that God opposed the proud. And we see that is very, very clear. God opposed the proud and exalts the humble. And right there, you start seeing the idea of the duality or the binary here of Saul being the proud and David exalting the humble. Very clear to see that. Next is, despite human evil, God is always at work. And we see what's going on here. We're going to really kind of flush that out with more Saul in the last few paragraphs that we'll read today, I think. Or actually, we're going to start with that, with the idea of the murdering of all the priests as well. Next is God will raise up a messianic king, and we know that basically through the whole Samuel here is that we're leading down the line here to get to the Davidic line. That will be the line that the Messiah will come from. Okay, so that's roughly right in the very beginning of Samuel, 1 through 7-ish. And what you start to see once Saul comes into the picture, how does he come into the picture? Chapter 4 through 7 is going to bring up the idea of the Philistines coming in against Israel. And there's a scene here, we get to see that they steal the Ark of the Covenant. Basically, it seems to me that the Israelites are holding this Ark of the Covenant up as kind of this power thing that's going to give them power, instead of actually giving their faith in God here. The Philistines think that it's really powerful, basically, for certain reasons. They steal it, and thinking that they can have all the power. but God sends a plague over them. From the covenant and or from the Ark of the Covenant, and they return the Ark. So there's all this throughout history. The Ark of the Covenant is this thing that keeps getting moved around and around and around and around. Even today, they're not really sure. There's some ideas about where it might be. The point is, and another reference here that I got, what is the point of all this and why the Philistines versus Israel and this moving of the covenant back and forth is that God is not Israel's trophy. I thought that was an excellent statement. God opposes pride, and Israel must remain humble, going back again to signify, I think, the idea that David is coming. After this, chapters 8 through 31 in general, it leads us right up to about where we are. Chapters 8 through 10 is the Israelites wanting a king, and they're like all the other nations. They want this king to be appointed. They go to Samuel to ask for this, and Samuel inquires of God about this, and they appoint Saul. And at first, this seems like a really good idea because Saul is, and we're going to get into this too. I think of what's happening. I was going, why is Saul going against David so much? But you start to see all the character flaws that come in that go back to this idea of Hannah's song in the very beginning, that God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. Saul's, there's all kinds of flaws here. He's dishonest, he's prideful, he lacks integrity, he directly disobeys God's commands, or he obeys God's commands, but he only partially does them at certain points, things like this. And Saul's kind of the epitome or exemplary kind of character in the way that he looks. I think there's a vainness that's going along with this as well, it seems to be. And at first everybody loves Saul. He does great. He's, he starts off really well, right? But then as we go forward, we know that David comes in. Okay, so let's see. Where will we start here? And I think when you're thinking about dividing these up too, it's kind of an interesting way that they divided them up. So when you see Saul and the way he is, so we have two different ways. You have Saul in the end of 1 Samuel here, and then 2 Samuel is about David. What you're seeing is this idea that Saul's coming to power, and then he's going to end with his death a little bit later. That's going to end us with book 1 here. At the same time, David's coming to power, and by the time we get to the height of his power, we're starting to see in the 2 Samuel there. So the way they've laid it out in the text, or they've divided the scroll, it seems to be very much on purpose. Okay, let's see. Where do we want to start? I think I want to start back with this idea. First of all, I kind of want to start with this idea because there's so many ideas of David coming because of fate, or it's this idea that there's this Davidic king, this line coming. And I'd like to read a little bit from a commentary that I found. I'd like to talk to you about this for just a second before we actually go back into the scriptures. It's about God's providential guidance. It says Romans 8:28 summarizes well what the author of Samuel 1 meant to convey to his readers. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. God is certainly the one who providentially and individually guided the lives of chosen individuals such as Hannah, Samuel, and David. Even the life of Saul was in God's providential care. See Samuel 1:9-16. The course of life is different for each individual, but the same God, not fate, consistently and graciously guides one's life. That's the moment I want to focus on there for just a second and kind of talk about that, because I've struggled understanding this as well. The course of life is different for each individual, but the same God, not fate, consistently and graciously guides one's life. Though it is often not recognized by human agents, God's timing is always perfect, for he is Lord of history. And I know because I'm a classicist and teach about the Romans and the Greeks a lot, I don't know if you're aware of this, but fate is a lot different in their world and in their culture. In fact, the idea of fate for the Greeks and Romans was that the gods are omnipotent, with a catch, basically. They're all powerful, and even with those, the idea of their hierarchies there, you have the one God, usually Zeus, right? That's the most powerful, the king of the kings, I guess. But even the gods are afraid of the fates. And the fates are really interesting in their culture. And you get to see how they go through all these different eras of change and in different literatures, of course. But there's three of them. There's three fates, and they're represented by women. And you'll start to see different images of them throughout the different eras. In the beginning, they were mostly younger women, and you see the sculptures where they were younger women. And as time goes by, they end up being older and older and older, to where they end up becoming these old, wise women, basically. And in their culture's fate, or they would call it the fates, I guess. The fates themselves overruled the gods. So fate's up here, hierarchy. The gods are here, even Zeus, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so even the gods had to bend to the actual idea of fate. If you start thinking about all the old mythologies, Zeus was, taken to a cave. There's this whole thing about his fate and things, because fate's up here. But now we switch it, and the idea here, okay, obviously. There's a couple things that often get confused too, and I think with a lot of critique and trying to understand this, I saw quite a few different references of the idea of theological fatalism. Are you aware of what fatalism is?
Just a negative attitude, or
What's
It can be.
is going to happen. What's going to happen is going to happen. It doesn't really matter.
That's right. That's exactly right. So basically you have something called, we're like, well, that's theological fatalism. And what fatalism is, it's a little bit different than the idea of just fate, because when you think about fate, you're not saying, and this is a big divide here, fatalism, theological fatalism is going to say something like, just like Diana said, no matter what I do, every little thing is already determined. Like, there's no way out at all. Basically, in fatalism, you take free will, and free will is out the door. There's basically no free will at all. You don't get to choose anything. Even the idea of you choosing things is because of this idea of cause and effect, I'm assuming. Something like this, that it's set in motion, and that me just picking up my glasses for a second that's already been determined because of this line of events. And there really is no such thing as free will. That's the difference. Over here, free will is acceptable. There's this idea that you have this personal, obviously you have choice, but it's also impersonal as well, because, well, the idea is that you are being indirectly moved by things, especially something like God, I think. Okay. I'd like to read a little bit about these terms, and I found another reference that I really like, and we'll see how much these actually come up, because I hear these, and they're so similar that we seem to put them together, at least I do, and I know that's often confusing for me, so I'm like, I found a really good little reference here about this. Here's a reference where someone talks, I forgot to get the author's name, I should have, and I totally forgot it, and I'm not online at the moment, so. The difference between sovereignty and providence, and I just read the passage about God's providential guidance. That's basically what's happening. But there's a difference between sovereignty and providence. It says that sovereignty does not contain the idea of purposeful action, but the term providence does. Sovereignty focuses on God's right and power to do all that he wills, but in itself, it does not express any design or goal. Of course, God's sovereignty is purposeful. It does have a design. It does pursue a goal. But we know this not simply because God is sovereign, but because he is wise, and because the Bible portrays him as having purposes in all that he does. My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purposes. Or purpose, Isaiah 46:10. The focus here is on God's sovereignty, considered not simply as powerful, but as purposeful. Historically, the term providence has been used as shorthand for this more specific focus. The building blocks of providence. It's difficult to be certain about the history of a word, why it came to carry its present meaning, but here's a suggestion, and it goes into just a little bit of Latin, so I kind of like this a little bit. I'm like, okay, I see it now. The idea of providence is made up of two basic words, and this is why a lot of students will study Latin, particularly because of the prefixes. So almost any prefix goes back to Latin that we see. English derivatives go back to it all the time. And something like pro is a good example. It means in front of, or having sight out in front of you, something like that. And then providence. This part's this you probably even recognize this, weedy, weedy, weaky. The weedy part is to see, or I saw, I came, I saw, I conquered. So to basically seeing out in front of you. But the word providence doesn't technically mean that. It's changed in its form in the early days. So he says the word providence is built from the word provide, which has two parts. Pro, forward, on behalf of, out in front of, and vide, to see. So you might think that the word provide would mean to see forward, to foresee, but it doesn't. It means to supply what is needed. Back to what he's talking about, God's providential guidance, okay? To supply what is needed, to give sustenance or support. So in reference to God, the noun providence has come to mean the act of purposeful providing for or sustaining and governing the world. Just a tidbit there I thought was really interesting in seeing how all this lays out. Any comments about that with fate, providence, fatalism?
I had a comment about fate. I was thinking about that book, Return of the Gods, with Jonathan Cahn, and he's explaining about, when Christ came in, the gods went out, they kind of took the background. And so I'm thinking with fate, if they believed, I didn't know that, right, that how fate worked into their belief system, then God brought in choice and freedom. So Christ, when he came to the earth, brought choice and freedom into a world that believed in fate, right? Like you didn't have it, it was what it was. So that was, again, a message that they had never heard, right? That was something that was foreign to them, even as the Israelite, even the Jews, that was foreign to them because they had been, they were living in a world of people worshiping gods. So everything was different than they'd ever heard. And so that was one of the things, and I didn't know about that.
Is that a Gentile or a universal thing? With the Jewish tradition, did they have that same structure of fate over the gods?
I don't think they probably would have, but, they weren't strong in a belief system either. They were just in law, right? They were so involved that you don't know how they were thinking about this whole fate thing and the gods, and because some of them got mixed up with, I'm sure, worshiping gods,
Well, and
that were Jews.
That reminds me of people's attitude back then about why someone was sick,
Right.
or why someone was in poverty. Well, that's just their lot in life, or
Right.
what sin did they commit that brought them into such low estate?
Well, just like us, we kind of get it all mixed up, grace and law and,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we do that.
So they mixed it up too.
Yeah, the healing, the people that so believe in healing and prosperity is like,
Right.
well, what's wrong with you? Where's your faith that you're not?
Well, what did they say about the man that got, was it his sin or was it,
Right. His parents.
They're
or what?
mixed up in a culture just like we are that, did their parents sin? Did he sin? Is that why he can't get healed? Is that why he has that disease? Is God put it on him? You know what I mean? So they were mixed up in that belief system too. So when Christ brought a whole new system in so many ways, this was one of them.
Yeah.
Is this faith thing.
Yeah.
What did you say? It is what it is. What's going to happen is going to happen.
And that,
Yeah.
I remembered the song, Que Sera, Sera.
Whatever will be,
will be,
The future's not ours to see.
What
Yeah.
pops into my head is it's a denial of the spiritual realm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's completely
Just trying to
taken
wrap
away.
our
Yeah.
minds around, 1 + 1 always equals 2.
Well, it also showed
the god like Zeus in them, they put their faith more in fate
Yes.
Exactly.
than those gods.
Yeah.
Yes, so
the
that,
gods serve no purpose almost.
yeah.
As well as the objects. I think that's what it's coming back with the Ark of the Covenant, which is a very holy thing, but they're using it kind of like the trident of Neptune or something. It's something that's powerful, and I have the object now. We're going to see with the ephod. I think it's pronounced ephod a little bit later. Maybe it's very similar, or I want to unpack that too, but the idea that wasn't what you were supposed to do. Great. So I want to back up just a minute because this is worth commenting for. I'm not sure if you weren't here the last session or so, but the Ahimelech scene is very important. I want to start actually on chapter 22:14, just really quickly, and then we're going to kind of march through some of chapter 23. Basically, up until this point, and let's just review really quick that why has Saul turned on David? That's a great question, and I kind of struggled with that going through the chapters as we went back for review. I'm like, wait, what is the moment? As far as I can tell, it's just that David starts getting so much attention because he's winning and becoming a great general, or whatever you call this, great leader, and all the women are swooning over him too. Saul's kind of good looking. David's very humble, but he's obviously got this appeal of a great leader, right? And it seems at this point, there's just a turning point where Saul just switches and the jealousy kicks in. Something like that where it's, oh, this guy's really just, he's going to take over. He kind of sees it. He doesn't want it to happen, basically. Okay, so there's this moment where Ahimelech he starts questioning him. And this is chapter 22:14. I'll read it really quickly. It's worth reading. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, because he's questioning the priest, and Ahimelech said, who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Which is true. We know David is really a great servant to Saul. He's done nothing. And then I began to inquire of God for him. Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. And the king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not shew it to me. Shew means show. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, Turn thou, Doeg's an Edomite, turn thou and fall upon the priest. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priest, and slew on that day 75 persons that did wear a linen ephod or ephod. Okay, we're going to bring that back up with the ephod. So he slays them all. Jump forward to where we are roughly, just a few passages from there in chapter 23, and we start to see David's left. He's basically going off into the wilderness. I'm going to call it generally the wilderness. He's definitely going to different spots, and you can even pull up certain maps when you see this. They have it in maps where you see the Dead Sea and all the places where he's bouncing around to the different locations, of course. For very, very details, I'll just generally call that the wilderness, see what it is to me. But David, let's get caught up here. I think we left off somewhere 23, 5? So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and brought away their cattle and smote them with a great slaughter. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah, and what's going on there is that the Philistines are attacking them. Saul's doing nothing, or as far as I remember. So David steps in, okay? And it came to pass when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David to Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. I would love to show a picture of this ephod. Do you know what it looks like? Have you seen these images? You need to Google it at some point. I wish we had one. I don't know if John could pull up one. But it's exactly like Pastor Leah says. There's quite a few things. You have the Jewish priests they're dressed in just in a very adorned set of robes and cloths and different things they're wearing. As far as I know, the ephod is the main vest that they're wearing that's underneath everything. It's basically the main part of the robe that's laying over them. I'm assuming this is where all the evolution of this idea comes with the robes later. But there's things attached to it. Like in the middle, there's a breastplate, and it's gold, and it's filled with all these gems, and all these gems radiate depending on certain things. It's kind of sophisticated the way it looks even. But that ephod is the idea of the cloak, as far as I remember. So he's bringing it, that he came down with the ephod in his hand. Let's see, so there we go. Let's see where this kind of march through here and pick up. Get right in place here with my notes. Where are your notes?
I have a note here in my Bible that says anger is the most debilitating emotion that we wrestle with. Because when you're super angry, you can't think straight.
That's what it is. I know this so well, I think all of you do. The idea of just even getting a little frustrated at something. Especially trying to work on something and you can't get it fixed. And you're sitting there working, yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, and then something breaks that shouldn't have broken in the first place, and then you got a breaking thing over another breaking thing.
You been watching me?
It happens all of us, Chris.
And then you hurt your toe because you kick it.
Yeah, then you hurt your toe. And then that frustration leads to deeper frustration, which then eventually leads pretty quickly to being irate, being very angry. It's a very dangerous thing. I start turning green and greener as I go. The next thing you know, you're running around town ripping your shirt off or something. So yeah.
Well, and I was thinking about jealousy, because I had read something, because anyway, somebody close to me has a real bad problem with jealousy. And it said that jealousy is one of the emotions that leads to death. That like you'll kill over it.
It can
Yeah.
consume you.
It can consume you, and
Yeah.
it leads to killing, murder.
How would you,
And I thought,
how would you clarify the difference between jealousy and envy?
yeah, and that's what I can't remember, but it was definitely a different, it was different. And jealousy was the
Because
worst of
jealousy is
it.
not a deadly
Yeah.
sin, but envy is.
Yeah.
It's very close, isn't it? It seems like it's under the umbrella, pretty close to it. Envy and jealousy, yeah. I always consider jealousy more of a relationship thing,
Yeah.
where envy is more of a general thing applied to
Right.
everything else.
I
But that's a good question.
Yeah, I think envy is focused on the object, the stuff.
There you go.
And
yeah.
jealousy is focused on the person.
On a person.
who has
More
the
personal.
stuff.
Right, so
Yeah.
that's where it can lead
Yeah.
to murder, because it's focused on a person,
Yeah.
right, instead of an object.
Mhm.
So I just remember reading that and thinking, wow, jealousy is a big deal,
Oh, yes.
right, to allow that to sit and ruminate, or
Mhm.
whatever Pastor said.
This ephod, when David actually does become king, I wanted to point out here, as I read ahead, trying to make sure that I'm understanding what's coming a little bit too. And it's been a while since I've read David. When David does actually become king, David appoints Abiathar as one of his priests. This is later off in 2 Samuel, of course. And Abiathar is one of the priests of the royal court, along with a guy named Zadok. And I'm mentioning this because, again, and I just think it's interesting to follow this path of the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. These two priests carry the Ark of the Covenant out of the city. Okay, that's later on. We'll see that in 2 Samuel. He came down with the ephod in his hand. Okay, so we kind of understand there what an ephod is. It's going to come back up in just a few more passages. 23:7. And it was told Saul that David was come to Keilah. And Saul said, God hath delivered him into mine hand, for he is shut in by entering into a town that hath gates and bars. Okay? And the idea of gates and bars can obviously be this idea of protection, but it's also this idea that could be a trap. So again, Saul believes that the Lord's still on his side. Instead of actually considering whether the Lord has more approved David now, he's kind of blinded by this idea, much less he himself is on the side of the Lord, more or that's the comment from Pastor Leah there.
I wonder if it might be that Saul was speaking this lie out loud so as to try to overcome the servants who would not act on his behalf earlier. I wonder if they were witnessing this audible comment to help them, think that maybe God's back on Saul's side.
That's a great comment. I think that's a really good comment. I think you're right. I think there's this idea that we forget about the idea of the oratory. And as we know, I have a book
The
called
spin,
The what?
Saul's spin.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's his, exactly. It's his spin. It's his rhetoric. I guess you go back to that. That's it. Yeah. And is he really feeling that? I don't think so. And many of Pastor Leah's comments throughout here about the idea of it being in the flesh. It's not in the idea of the spirit or the idea of actually obeying God. In the moment, he knows he's trying to keep his followers, and Saul says, well, God has delivered him to me. Right? That's a great point.
Yeah, and like where he burns the incense or wasn't it an incense or a sacrifice or something? And he's like, well, the people were about to, the soldiers were about to desert, and I had to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chapter 23:8. And Saul called all the people together to war, and to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Now remember, this is Pastor Leah's comment, that Keilah was attacked by the Philistines and Saul did nothing to help them. And yet here we find Saul hightailing it to Keilah for the sole purpose of killing David, not to run off the Philistines. We also see that a little later on, Saul's downfall is basically because of this obsession. If David and Saul could have reconciled and found mutual peace, they could have combined their armies against the Philistines. This doesn't happen. They're divided, and Saul's sons and Saul will be destroyed ultimately a little later on, as we'll see. 23:9. And David knew that Saul secretly practiced mischief against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring hither the ephod.
What version of Bible is that?
This is the King James.
King James. Mine's
Use the
different.
word evil here.
And David knew that Saul secretly practiced evil, isn't it? Is a translation?
Evil
Mine says
in the
mischief.
New King James.
New King James says evil? Yeah, King James says mischief
Yeah.
against him. A little stronger to go with evil there, which I guess we could say is exactly what it is. And he said to Abiathar the priest, bring hither the ephod. So there's a part there. It seems to me that David's in this transitional, or is it safe to say that we're sort of in this transition of Old Covenant and New Covenant here? The idea here is that David is trusting in God, but he's still going for the actual tool to be able to communicate with God, sort of similar to this idea of the Ark of the Covenant a little earlier. I'm not sure what to think about that. Bring hither the ephod. And the idea of inquiring with God, I think Pastor Lita, she has somewhere in her notes, you have to be a prophet, a priest, or a king. Mm-hmm. Are we just to assume that, I guess according to the righteousness, that David is the king now, or he's already in line with becoming the king? So he's able to inquire with God? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, that he's anointed is what she was saying. Yeah.
So I understand, it may be a few verses ahead of me, but this ephod thing here, when the stones do what they do, it's like reading the tea leaves, that's how he's getting the messages or the
Something like that,
confirmation
yeah.
or something like that.
Was it the
Yeah,
feminine?
It's never clear how it works, but
No.
somehow it gives an answer of yay or nay.
It's not really ever clear exactly. And then the priest, when he would wear that, I don't know what you call it, that chest plate with all the rubies.
Right.
Somehow, again, we're not really told. That would be interesting, John, you and I to dive in and figure out if there's any ancient texts on how that worked. And apparently,
Surely
some of the
there is.
stones
Yeah.
would light up, and I'm sure they had a way to do it, like, we have Morse code.
The way you turned with the sun, or something's going on.
There was something like that.
Yeah.
They were like, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure. There's got to be something
Yeah.
somewhere.
Very interested in that. 'Cause
Yeah.
It's a visual thing.
It seems to me it would be buried in Leviticus where no.
You never read it.
Right.
Oh wait, we forgot about Leviticus.
It's leading us.
Yeah.
She's out there, she's out there.
It might be somewhere how it actually worked. Those stones would light up because it was the high priest could only wear that, and that was his job to go, and the Lord would tell the high priest,
Yeah.
this is what you need to do, you go back and you tell the people, so that would be interesting, I'm not exactly sure how it works either.
And every time they would say, and he inquired of the Lord, and
Which
I
he
believe
does.
it's through that ephod generally is
Yeah.
the way he's
Right.
inquiring.
Which is funny, God doesn't work through that way now, because now we have the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And then, well, of course, then you go back to the Old Testament too, it's interesting how he spoke to Elijah. And he said, you know, the Lord said that I'm not in the thundering of the clouds and the quaking of the earth and all this, but I'm in that still small voice. So he was just directly speaking to Elijah, you know, that way, which is interesting as well.
Chapter 23:10, and then said David, O Lord God of Israel, thy servant hath certainly heard that Saul seeketh to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. 11, will the men of Keilah deliver me up into his hand? Will Saul come down as thy servant hath heard? O Lord God of Israel, I beseech thee, tell thy servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then said David, will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver thee up. So, even though he's helping them out, the idea here is that I'm assuming there's this confusion about who the true king is or something here, and they're still going to side with Saul, or they have something against David. I was sort of in the dark there. I'm not sure why they are so much against him at this point.
There's a
Maybe
lot
they're
here.
afraid of Saul, because he is the official
Yeah.
king. And they don't
Yeah.
even know that David's been anointed king. Only a few people know that at
Right.
this point. And so they're like, oh man, we don't want a king coming against us.
Exactly.
Oh, because he just killed all those priests and Ahimelech.
Ahimelech and his priests, yeah. So David and his men, this is verse 13. Then David and his men, which were about 600, wasn't it 400 before? So he's picked up some men here. Arose and departed out of Keilah and went whithersoever they could go. Go wherever they could go. And it was told Saul that David was escaped from Keilah, and he forbare to go forth. So he didn't go forth. He didn't push here to go forth. Okay. Let's see, yeah, and she has a note about this. 200 more men have joined David and fled from Keilah, knowing that Saul was headed for him. Someone told Saul that David had escaped, and Saul gave orders to just stop. Verse 14, and David abode in the wilderness as strongholds, and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. And there's a little section here, I'm going to start analyzing this a little bit here, 16 through 18, because Jonathan comes back in. So 23, 16 through 18. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said unto him, fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee, and that also Saul my father knoweth. And they two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. There's a lot in those three little verses there. First of all, we see that Jonathan comes back into the picture. And there was this great reference I saw in a video, I was watching some of this over the last couple of nights, where they compared Jonathan and David and start listing all the attributes. This idea that Jonathan is a prince, first of all, I guess, and David's a shepherd. And then they go through all these little things to show you that, again, there's this sort of binary thing that's going on, kind of like Saul and David, but now instead of being this idea of really bad guy and really humble guy, you get Jonathan and David. It is more about the idea of what their status would be objectively, and then coming in and why Jonathan really takes on to David as the next king. A lot of things to say there. Jonathan basically is a soldier, right? Like he's off doing, he's got armor, he's got the status and all this, and David doesn't.
What occurs to me is another covenant. Anybody keep track? How many covenants
Yeah.
come between Jonathan and David? And what happened to the old one? Are they just building on it? Or?
Well, I think it was in,
Reinstating it.
I'm assuming that's what it is. It's a reinstatement or something. There's that moment where Jonathan and David, remember, where he's like, he's going to come to the feast or the festival or something like that. And David says, I'm not going to be there. Tell Saul that I'm going to be over the next, at my father's house or something, yeah, somewhere nearby. And see what his reaction is, and he shoots the arrows or something. If I shoot them past you, you need to run. Or if I shoot, there's that section there. There's where that other covenant, and they made a covenant.
And they also made a covenant back early on, the time that he let him put his armor on. Remember, Jonathan told David, "Here, put my armor on and everything. Like I know you're going to be king."
It just gives it to him. Yeah.
And then they made a blood brothers covenant.
Here it is again.
So that's got to be the third.
And he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you, and you shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto you. That part there, and I looked up a note on that, and I shall be next unto you. What does that actually mean? And there's a note on it that says, and Pastor Leah mentions this too, to this, that it means it's second in rank. It does not mean that he's an heir. He's not an heir. To David, it's just that he's second in rank, next in authority to the king.
And that was a very humble thing for Jonathan,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
Because he is humbling himself under the will of God
Yeah.
to be second in line when he should be, in the world's view, first.
He should be the king, right?
Right,
He's pledging allegiance.
yes.
Exactly. Let's see. Pastor Leah's comment here. Interesting that Jonathan tells David that Saul knows God has chosen David and Jonathan will be second in line. If Saul knows this, why is he not conforming to God's will? Because he's operating in the flesh.
Yes.
Which goes back to that again. Yeah.
Yeah. Jealousy,
Yeah.
anger. all
Because
that.
of the jealousy, exactly. And the two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. Okay. Let's see. Pastor Leah makes a really good comment here, and I'd like to kind of, because she's made so many great comments, I'd like to at least point out one here that I've always been a little bit confused about as well. You may have been too. She mentions that, and I'll just read the comment, but notice here that although Saul knows God's will and Jonathan knows God's will, Jonathan has still not completely sided with David, who is a type of Jesus. Jonathan is holding something back. The words that Jesus spoke come to me here, Pastor Leah, from Luke 14:26. If any man come to me and hate not his father.
Ah, yes.
Okay, that's a not. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life, he cannot be my disciple.
Yeah, and there's another place. And leave your family.
Yes.
Leave your father and mother and brothers.
Yeah. I looked this up, and there is this comment in one of my commentaries here about that, and I'd like to read just a section of it here. Those who would be Christ's disciples must love their family less
Yes.
than they love Christ. So the idea of hate here has and Pastor Leah makes this comment, it's not exactly the way we see it. It's a different kind of word. There's a little bit of a slip in the translation here or something, I think as well. Love their family less than they love Christ. Bear the cross and follow Christ and relinquish everything. These are complementary ways. These are complementary ways of describing complete commitment. The first condition for discipleship is to hate one's father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, and life. Hating, and here's the comment here, is a Semitic expression for loving less.
Right.
Well, why don't we use those words?
That's what
That's a great point.
That's the way I've heard it taught is love less.
Love less,
Well, I
yeah.
don't have a problem reading an extra word there.
Yeah.
Jesus uses the commandment, thou shalt love. I leave this commandment with you, to love your brother.
And the greatest of these.
Yeah, it's love. I mean, the word hate coming out of
Yeah.
Jesus' mouth
That
is,
seems like a poor translation.
yeah. Anyway.
Let's see. Verse 19 is really important. I want to talk about the Psalms as well. And when we looked at Hebrews 1 through 10, there's so many references to especially the Psalms. If you have your note there, I believe it's 110 in Psalms for Hebrews. He mentions it quite a bit. And there's that moment about the Exodus in the wilderness. Again, I kind of wonder if this idea of David wandering around the wilderness isn't this very symbolic thing that's referencing that as well. But this next verse, this comes up with a psalm. I'm going to bring this up. Verse 19. Then came up the Zephites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood, in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jehoshaphat? I know I'm probably mispronouncing half of those words. The Zephites were Judaites, note here. But they were not happy to have David and his men in the area. Psalm 54. So this is Psalm 54. I'm going to turn there real quick. I want to read this. I think it's really important. Psalm 54 is referencing this moment, 1 Samuel 23:19. See if I can bring it up here really quickly. Give you just a second there. And the idea is that this Psalm 54 gets repeated in a lot of different ways throughout. For people that are under threats of persecution, first of all, sing on behalf of their brethren that are in danger, which is what's happening. He's in this territory, right? So Psalm 54, Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them, Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies, cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies. There you go. The idea of being under the threat of persecution and singing upon or on behalf of brethren in danger, pretty common psalm there. Let's see.
Yeah, the notes in my New King James before Psalm 54 is worded out directly references what you had said. David, when the Ziphites went and said to Saul, is David not hiding with us?
Yes, yes.
I don't know if everybody's Bible has
Mine
notes.
has that.
So,
A call for God to overcome enemies.
Let's see. We only have just a few minutes left, and there's quite a few passages. I'm not sure. We may not finish, but the rest of the chapter is more or less a lot of just going back and forth as Saul's trying to find him. And I do have a couple notes here from Pastor Leo. She's got plenty in here. Obviously, every single passage you could really dive into with some commentary, but maybe we'll just kind of march through some of these and see where we end up. So that was 19, right? Am I in the right spot? Okay, go back, because I want to make sure I'm in the right reference here. I think that was 19. So verse 23:20 here. Now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. And Saul said, Blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. Again, this I think goes back to Chris's comment there. Go, I pray you, prepare yet, and know and see his place where his haunt is, and who hath seen him there. For it is told me that he dealeth very subtly. See therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself, and come ye again to me with the certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. And they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain on the south of Jessamon. Saul also and his men went to seek him, and they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. 27. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called that place Selah Hamalakoth. And David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. And I think as we go forward here in the next few chapters, you're going to see that that's that part where he moves off and he's going to go get in battle with the Philistines, and a lot of things bad are going to happen to him. Comments from Pastor Leah here in the very few remaining chapters, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory for the most part. He's just chasing him around. But in the end, Pastor Leah's comment here, another thing we need to take away from this story is that God may not deliver you out of a situation immediately. And this is him, this is David, just, running around in fear in here. How much is this? Because we're going to see this. Isn't there a moment coming up where David has a chance to murder Saul, but he doesn't, right? So there's this idea too that he's still remaining this humble, trying to do the right thing, give him a second chance. And I think there's even more than that. I think there's more than just one chance here that's coming up. Pastor Leah, I know this is not what any of us want to hear, but sometimes he leaves us here for a while to test our faith and see if we actually trust him, and that's exactly what I think David's doing.
I think that's a great point about David doing the right thing, and what just popped into my head is that it speaks to our witnessing, our behavior. So he's acting the right way so that people can see his righteousness, and that will overcome all of Saul's stuff. So it's not, God's having him obey to be as a type of witnessing to Christ.
Yeah.
So that just popped into my head.
I
But I thought I would share it with you, but just the way I roll.
I remember the study we did about Solomon and, the wisdom and going over all this stuff, and the last thing they said was, the bottom line is, in Solomon, is just do the next right thing. And I thought that was a really good way to conclude it, that you could hang on to, is just do the next right
And I
thing.
gotta go back to verse 22, and Saul's telling people, hey, this guy's crafty.
Yeah. Well, I know I may have marched a little bit faster there in the end, but I felt that was just that's what's happening. And even Pastor Leah went through a lot of the main passages there right at the end and just marched right through with those final comments. So we actually took it forward, and I actually counted how many passages she was going through for the last couple of weeks, so not to go too fast, but not to go too slow either. So next time we will look at chapter 24, or hear some of her more comments on chapter 23 too, because I only got to not even half of them. She's very thorough, obviously, in the way she presents her lectures here in the discipleship. So either way, we should be starting somewhere on chapter 24, 1 Samuel, for next week's discipleship. Thank you so much.
I was gonna make one more comment I was thinking about the covenant thing, and making another covenant. And it made me think that marriage is a covenant, right? As far as God sees it, it's a covenant. Well, people break a covenant all the time, right? They break the covenant of marriage, or they reinstate the covenant, right? Somebody may have a ceremony just to say, hey, I still feel that same way about you. I'm still as committed to you. So I'm thinking, God never breaks a covenant, but flesh does. And so in all the turmoil that they're going through, they need to reinstate, hey, I still feel the same way, right? I haven't changed my idea of things. He still made covenant with David. You know what I'm saying?
I hear you, we're trying to flesh that topic out, and that context we got on Wednesday night about rhetoric. I mean, maybe that's just the way they spoke. When people are in agreement, it's a covenant.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah, where he's just reassuring David, because they're going through a lot, right?
Yeah, and here he is fighting with his father.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he
And-
wants to make sure David knows, no, I know you're gonna be king, I'm not against you.
Right. But he's having a hard time.
But yet, he still feels that
He's
loyalty
still got a
to his
piece of his
father,
heart
the
to his
king, that
father.
he can't quite go over
Exactly.
to David.
Well, how is that, how could that perhaps not be interpreted as some faith that maybe Dad will get his head out of his butt? You know what I mean? Kind of
Right,
So it's like,
Still kinda hanging on
yeah,
to,
okay.
maybe he'll wake up and,
Maybe he's hoping too, if he stays with this king, with Saul, that he could have some influence on him to moderate his jealousy.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. He loves his father, and that's the idea there is, you'll love your father and your mother, hold them valuable. And he's in a very odd spot
Yeah,
for that, because he's trying
We
to help
don't
them
go
see.
through life
Yeah.
wondering if this is our stand or die moment, or is that still in the future? Do I overreact now? So Jonathan's holding
Yeah.
an ace in his pocket, or maybe you're just, I mean, maybe it's not
He loves David.
where he has to say,
Yeah.
Exactly, he loves David too. That's the thing, and he knows that David's definitely has the integrity that needs to be the king, right? So,
Love doesn't stop you from seeing a fault in someone, though.
Yeah.
yeah, he clearly sees the faults.
yeah,
And that's a good point. But he doesn't want his father to hate him, yeah, and that's a real, yeah, that's intense. Yeah, he doesn't want his father to also hate him.